Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Misread signals, how history overlooked women code breakers. Bletchley Park is remembered as a land of male intellectuals who were supported by a staff of women in menial roles. The true story, however, is somewhat different. It has been described by two of my favourite female historians and friends of the show. The great Helen Fry said it's inspirational, and Claire Molly, who I've interviewed several times, said it's an important and exciting contribution to the history. Misread Signals, How History Overlooked Women Codebreakers is a new book by Dermot Turing. I'm delighted to welcome Dermot back onto the show again. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us one more time. And for those who don't know, the name is somewhat of a giveaway, I suppose you could say. With a name like Turing, this was always going to be somewhat of a passion project for you?
Well, yes, I guess so. I mean, I've got into the whole code-breaking story through the family connection, as you might imagine. But what I've tried to do is wean people off the idea that Bletchley Park, Alan Turing, and breaking the Enigma cipher machine were all that it was all about, and look at perhaps sort of slightly richer seam of stories that come at it from looking at it from different perspectives. So, as you say, this one is about women at Bletchley and the untold story of women who actually did code breaking, as opposed to what I think in the popular imagination is a whole bunch of sort of subordinate roles that weren't really terribly interesting.
Because if you think about how people look at women during the Second World War, it's either the Women's Land Army, with the famous poster and all that, or it's gals pushing the bomber command, but fighter command, as the Battle of Britain rages,
or pushing little models around on a tabletop.
Exactly. Or it's nipping out, making cups of tea, and typing up things at Bletchley Park. And one of the things people say to me, why are you so interested in the Second World War? And it's like, well, why wouldn't you be? Because now, 80 years afterwards, more stuff comes to light, and we look at it through different sets of eyes, as both Helen and Claire have said, because it's a woman's perspective, which perhaps 80 years ago, 50 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, the climate wasn't ready to acknowledge the vital part that women played in the Second World War.
It's very interesting how there's a sort of roller coaster in terms of what women's role in society has been perceived to be. I mean, just to sort of contextualize this, people ask me why what are you doing? You're a bloke. Why are you sort of writing about women's history? Well, I mean, it's kind of been in my DNA, if you like, because when I was at school, I was the only kid in my class whose mum went out to work. And so I've sort of had an alternative view about what women's role in society should be for the whole of my life. So I find it quite fascinating that during World War II, women were allowed to have these professional code-breaking roles, and in quite significant numbers. And yet when the peace began, women were sort of brushed out of the workplace and expected to go back to the kitchen and do sort of traditional women's jobs. And that sort of strikes me as being very bizarre. And it's only in the last sort of, couple of decades that we've been clawing back a role for women in society. And we've still got big gaps. I mean, in the UK, for example, we've still got a ridiculous situation where a tiny fraction of girls and young women present themselves for STEM subjects at A-level and for university degrees. And then that means that we're massively underrepresented in terms of women in tech jobs, which is bonkers, frankly.
And if you look at it, I mean, that whole, women. It's the point of the Second World War. One of the reasons people are sacrificing themselves is we're going to build a land fit for heroes, and that's heroes and old-fashioned speak, and heroines as well. And you have these women who can't get into university, who can't do it, etc., etc., etc. And they, when the war finishes and we've a manpower shortage, you would think that women would be welcomed with open arms. but the history is unfortunately exactly. You are shaking your head there, Dermot, in exasperation with the whole situation.
Despair. But yes, it's an odd situation. But here's the thing: we have grown up in that sort of post-war environment, and I think imagining rather than checking, but imagining that all the women who worked at Bletchley Park had these kind of subordinate roles, because that's the picture we expect to see. And if you go and look at the archival records, then your prejudices are kind of underlined, because it says, oh, look, there's all these men of the professor type, and it is men who are on the emergency list of people to be called up in September 1939 to become codebreakers. And then there's a list of, rather shorter list of women, and they're called clerical staff, and they're called typists, and they're called linguists, which people assume meant that they did translation work. And so we've kind of said, oh, well, look, that just proves the point, doesn't it? That all the men, all the code-breaking jobs were done by men, and all the menial support staff roles were done by women, and 'twas ever thus. And I think that's a kind of the received wisdom that I've set out to investigate, and then ended up challenging at the end of it all.
I like the idea of like linguists, because that can cover a multitude of intelligent sins, can't it? I mean, that's code breaking and it's not just saying getting your German declensions correct.
Well, let me give you my favourite linguist story. Of all women codebreakers, there's probably one that people have heard of, and that would be Joan Clark, because she was played by Keira Knightley as Alan Turing's girlfriend in the Imitation Game movie. So Joan Clark was a real character. Joan Clark was hired, she had a mathematics degree from Cambridge, and she was hired to work on the Enigma problem because they needed mathematicians for that kind of thing. Jolly good. And she was very good at it, so they wanted to give her a promotion. She was hired in as clerical officer, sort of in the top grade. But the way to get a woman promoted, she couldn't be promoted to one of the code-breaking grades, so they promoted her to linguist, and they made her fill in a form. And the form said, the first question on the form was, what languages do you speak? And she put none, because she's a mathematician.
Yeah.
So Joan Clark gets promoted to linguist. Linguist doesn't have anything to do with languages. It's a job grade, if you like. And I think people have been bewitched. They've been mesmerized by the words they see in the archival material. It says that this woman was a clerical officer, and this woman was a typist, and this woman was a linguist, and so forth. And not realized that those were just pay grades, if you like. They weren't actually job descriptions. And so we found typists doing code breaking, and they were called typists just because they were cheap employees, and you graded somebody as a typist, you pay them less. They don't do any typing.
Yeah.
But, and so it's very easy to assume that the records are actually telling you the truth when they're actually trying to tell you about pay scales.
So how do you look then beyond the pay grade? How do you sort of blow the dust off these particular archives and get to the real stories?
Well, thank you, Joan Clark, for sort of giving the game away, because having found her own memoir that said that she was a mathematician graded as a linguist, I started wondering about this. And then you can find there are little sort of vestiges left in the other archives, like sort of section reports on who was doing what. And then after a bit, you begin to build up a much broader picture where you can discover, like, for example, my favourite typist was a lady called Helen Hazelden, who was actually decoding Spanish records at a time when we were worried that Franco might go into the war on the same side as the Axis powers. She was responsible for reconstructing cipher tables that were used by the Spanish to disguise their coded messages. It's not trivial work, and she's graded typist. This is, and I find this out from just a report from her section head on who's doing what and who's doing well. And there's lots of sort of records like that, but there's no, here's the thing. I mean, people have asked me sort of, is there some kind of special magic word that you can put into a search engine and then all the records of the women who are acting as codebreakers ping out? No, unfortunately not. It's a slog through the files and then you find these little tidbits here and there. But it's interesting stuff.
I mean, presumably this is also under the Official Secrets Act as well, isn't it? So it's not like, the war ends and they can come and, my role at Bletchley Park or my role, how, was it Monty, or Rommel, my partner's downfall, etc. They can't publish what they've been up to for decades.
Well, of course. And so, you're hinting at sort of one of the many reasons why we didn't know about this before. It's right until the late 1970s, early 80s that anybody was allowed to speak about what happened at Bletchley Park during World War II. The women who were acting as codebreakers in Bletchley Park, many of them were getting on in years, just as the men who had broken codes at Bletchley Park were. And I think many of the stories, many of the written records, people sort of writing memoirs and sort of, I was there kind of, accounts. The men had a point to prove because they hadn't got sort of battlefield medals. And so, they had something to say to sort of, reassert themselves as being sort of people who had contributed to the war effort when they hadn't been able to talk about it before. Very important for them. But women didn't have that point to prove, so they tended not to write as much about themselves. And then more recently, of course, because they were a bit older, they've passed, and the only people who have survived to tell the tale are the people who are very, very much younger, which typically means the young women who joined Bletchley Park as school leavers. And of course they were given subordinate roles because they were like 16 or 17 years old.
Yeah. And I suppose the other thing is the fact that you colour it through the thing of, was there any romance going on? It's like, look, we're trying to do a serious job here and break the Nazi codes. Don't colour us with that one.
Well, that's one of the things. It's not an official secret he was snogging behind the bike sheds, but so people did write about that stuff, but they couldn't talk about what the substantive stuff they'd done. So again, we get a sort of like a kind of slightly weird picture, which is full of social history and not got any sort of guts to it. Which, very interesting.
You're also looking though beyond the bike sheds of Bletchley Park, which that sounds like a great novel in itself.
Thanks for that. That's my next project.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, indeed. But I mean, people like Margaret Rock, Agnes Driscoll, excuse me. Who's the US codebreaker. So what's the experience like for women in the US working on code breaking?
Well, it's curiously, I mean, it's not identical, but there are some curious parallels. The US, the two principal US code breaking services, one in the US Army and one in the US Navy, were both essentially given a sort of starter motor kick by women. And you mentioned Agnes Driscoll. So she was the first US Navy codebreaker taken on at the end of World War I. She actually built the entire US Navy codebreaking service so that it was able to do the astonishing things it did in World War II under her tutelage. I mean, so she's an amazing character. And yet she, despite being somebody who ought to have this stellar reputation, she found that her character got utterly shredded by somebody who, for whatever reason, and I haven't been able to get to the bottom of this, just took against her in about 1942 and went on to become a very senior and highly respected figure himself in the NSA. When he retired, he gave an oral history account of what had happened during World War II. And, of course, that became the definitive record with this terrible account of Agnes Driscoll's reputation and her useless abilities as a codebreaker. It's all rubbish. You start reading other people's accounts of what she was like and what she was like to work for and what she'd achieved, you get a completely different picture. And yet just because this one senior guy, who everybody thinks is God, gives this oral history interview without being challenged on any of this stuff, she gets kind of sidelined from history as being somebody who was difficult to work with, didn't know her stuff, and so she gets ignored for about 30 years, which is just astonishing.
Oh, yeah.
So, very interesting how women sort of disappear from history because men sort of say bad things.
I'm just thinking about, what strikes me that as soon as you said that about one person's version of history, I mean, if you look at the book, the biography of Patton that is put out after the Second World War, which is rewritten by his wife and completely, to use the modern vernacular, disses all the other generals, basically saying that, and it's fabricated, but it goes for 40 years as a sort of root and branch of the American history.
Yeah, I learned quite a lot from this because, for the stuff that I have to look at, most of the people have passed. So you are highly dependent on things like oral histories that were captured in their retirement years. Their recollections may not be 100%, that, but you kind of expect a little bit of a challenge from the interviewer on some things, and when you don't get it, I learned that you have to be very wary about things. You have to. I guess this is just good journalism. You have to check your sources, but sometimes there's very little to go on, and it makes life difficult. But what we haven't really talked about, I guess, it's a bit dry so far. We said there are women who did code breaking, sort of so what. I think what has actually made this whole story come alive is when you actually get into the weeds of what these people were like, what these women code breakers were like. And some of them were great characters. Some of them were very interesting. Some of them had, very interesting life stories and careers. So I think, this is what livens it up. Yes, in a sense, it's a sort of an examination of why we have, overlooked all these women who did extraordinary things, but also it's sort of allowing them essentially to come into the limelight a bit, which is quite nice. Particularly, some of them are great fun. Because again, men are allowed to be maverick geniuses or oddballs, but women are supposed to have that two-dimensional quality. So what are they like then? What are their their particular special skill sets then? Away from cracking the enigma or whatever else they're doing, or being typists.
Yeah.
Well. We've got quite a few. One of the oddities is that there are these funny parallels that pop up. So I've got the lady called Anne Cara Christie, who joined the American Army Codebreakers in 1941 at a place called Arlington Hall in Washington. She went on in her subsequent career to be the deputy director of the NSA, and I expect people won't realise that the director of the NSA is like it stands in relation to the NSA like the king does in relation to the UK government. It's a figurehead person who has to be an admiral or a general, but not a codebreaker.
Yeah. So
she was the first woman to become the deputy director of the NSA, in other words, a top civilian post. Her long-term girlfriend, wrote amazing children's books. And I've got another codebreaker, a lady called Clarabelle Sperling, who broke codes for the UK Army during World War One. And guess what? She wrote children's books. I've got these sort of bizarre parallels here coming up, which I quite like. But so there's little sort of things like that. You think, that's cute. And I've read these books; they're good, actually.
I was going to say, do you then go combing through them for arcane references to code breaking?
No, I'm trying to find something that sort of isn't actually messages about sort of battleships or which diplomat met which other diplomat.
We're doing something in Los Alamos, but I can't tell you about it right now. Said Jack to Jill.
Yeah.
What about Astra Friedrichs? Now the name makes my little German orientated ears prick up. Yeah. What's her story?
Well, all right. So I think one of the things that nearly made me fall off my chair with astonishment was to discover that in the heart of Nazi Germany, and let's contextualize this, when Adolf Hitler came to power, all women in senior positions, in management or professional positions in the German civil service were fired.
Yeah.
Women were not supposed to have professional roles in the civil service. What is completely astonishing is that going against that is a small group of codebreakers in the German Foreign Office. So this is in Ribbentrop's Foreign Office. We've got codebreakers who are a mixed gender group. It's about 45% women. And that not only persists after Hitler comes to power, but it grows in the 1930s, and it grows further in the early war years, where they keep recruiting more women into the code-breaking service of the German Foreign Office. And these are not doing typing. These are not people doing typing. These are mathematicians who are, working out how to use punch card technology to break British and American ciphers. So, they're doing full-on code-breaking stuff. One of them is Asta Friedrichs. She's an interesting character. She was, I think, what we would probably call a non-qualified teacher. And I don't know how she found her way into code breaking, but she worked on busting American codes during World War II. And then when the war ended, she was interrogated by the British and the Americans about what she'd done. And then after that, she tried to get herself another teaching job. But at that stage, when there was all this denazification going on, the qualified teachers who could prove that they had not been members of the Nazi Party all scooped up all the teaching jobs that were available in Germany. And so she found herself sort of, on with nothing to do. So she actually emigrated to the US, which is really quite interesting. Her brother was a mathematics professor in the US who'd emigrated years and years before. So she had somewhere to go. The sequel to all this is that there's this amazing guy who died last year called David Kahn, who wrote the first book, which was a comprehensive history of code breaking from prehistoric times right through to the present.
Right.
He needed to have a source about what German code breaking had been like during World War II. And Asta Friedrichs was the person who actually told him what had happened and how it was organized. And so she has this extraordinary sort of arc of a career where as a teenager, she's running around Germany trying to escape the French who are threatening to invade during World War I. And she finishes up sort of on the opposite side of the fence, telling David Kahn the history of German code breaking. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary story. So she's a very interesting character.
Yeah, it's sort of like Kinderkuchen and code breaking, isn't it? It's the three sort of things. But so that's almost like an Operation Paperclip, but but willingly, isn't it? She ends up in the States because they were falling over themselves before the Soviets got them, and then they get this code breaking.
Well, exactly. So there's lots to learn on that story as well about the Germans who sort of essentially voluntarily offered themselves up to the Americans to say, we hope that you guys are going to see the light soon and realize that the real threat comes from your so-called allies, the Soviets, and we're willing to help you, which is sort of like quite interesting.
So when you've sort of collated it, I suppose the problem is you're discovering so much that you have to sort of put a full stop at the end of it, if you like, when you're actually writing this. Otherwise, it could be volume 1 of an 18-volume series.
So I was asked about this the other day and said, well, why don't you write about so-and-so? And, everybody's got their
favourite
character. And, the answer is, well, that would have been lovely to do, but what you really don't want to do, because it would just be unbelievably tedious to read is to say, oh, look, and here's another amazing character, and sort of do a potted biography, and then you turn the page and there's another one, and you think, well, okay, by the time I got to page 5, I've already gone to sleep. I know what to do. I'll give this to somebody for Christmas. So I've tried not to do that. I've tried to look at who was there and what were they doing, and then ask the question, well, how come we didn't know about this before? And that all becomes really quite an interesting question. So
the book is called Misread Signals. I could talk to you about this until Wednesday, but unfortunately, as always, time's winged chariot and all that, as it always happens to us, Dermot. It's called Misread Signals, How History Overlooked Women's Codebreakers. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. If people want to break the code and send coded messages to you, Dermot, where's the best place to find you online?
To find me online?
Yes, to find you online.
Well, I have a website, dermotturing.com, so there we are. That's fairly straightforward.
Easiest place to find you. Once again, it's been brilliant to speak to you. The book is called Misread Signals. Dermot, thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you for having me.